Well, howdy there, Internet students. It's Mr. Hermanson again. Today we're going to do lesson 1.2a, which is multiplying positive and negative numbers. Just a uh, quick little vocab. We're going to use the word integers quite a bit in here. Integers are like whole numbers, but they can be positive or negative. So numbers like -3, -5, 17. Those are integers. They can't have decimals or fractions, so take a note of that. Okay. So when you were a wee person in elementary school, you learned that multiplication is used for repeated addition. So we're going to use that to help us think about what happens when we multiply positive and negative numbers. So when you see this 2 times -8, another way you can think of that is -8 plus -8, which in the last unit we found out adding two negatives just makes it more negative, and you end up with -16. So here we want -3 two times. So that means we want -3 plus -3, which we're just going to total up all those negatives and we get -6. Okay. All right. Why don't you go ahead and see if you can do the rest of these. Write down each multiplication problem as a repeated addition problem. So you're going to do this. -5 plus -5 plus -5. We want that 4 times. And then find the total. Now when you're adding negatives, you just add them all up and your answer is negative. So you can do 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5, which is 20. And then just put a negative sign in front of it because they're all negatives. All right, so go ahead, you do the rest of them, write them out as a repeated addition problem, and then find the total. So do 4, 5, and 6. All right, here's what I got. Now, just a couple things to help you learn how to add when you have decimals and stuff, and you can do this stuff in your head. So you could add the 7 and the 7 and the 7, and that'd be 21, because 7 times 3 is 21, right? And then put two halves together, that makes a whole. So now we're at 22, and then you got one extra half, so -22 and a half. Number 5, adding 3 1/3 together makes a whole, right? Because 1/3 is one part out of 3. So if you add 3 of those together, you have 3 parts out of 3, which is a whole. So you can add the 5 and the 5 and the 5 is 15. One more makes 16. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is for you to look at these patterns and see if you can figure this out. In each of these, we multiplied a positive times a negative, or a negative times a positive if you want. So finish this statement. A positive times a negative will always equal, pick one of those two for your answers. I hope you were thinking it's always a negative. All right, so that helps with multiplication. If you're multiplying a positive and a negative, you always get a negative. All right, so these are all positives times negatives. So as soon as you see that, you just write negative because you know it's going to be negative. So this one's going to be a negative also, negative something. Okay, and then find a way to do that multiplication. Or like on this one, you could just add 45 twice if you'd rather do that. Personally, I would do maybe 2 times 40, which is 80, and then 2 times 5 is an extra 10, so that makes 90. Whenever you multiply by 10, that just puts a 0 on, so it's 320. Go ahead and give these others a shot, and the ones that I think are a little harder I'll discuss, so do as many as you can here. All right, so listen carefully now and you'll learn some ways to strengthen your multiplication skills here. A half means, well, you know what that means. That means divide by 2, right? So half of 10 is 5. Okay, right here, 2/3. Whenever it's more than 1/3 or one part, think about what one part would be. So 1/3 of 9, which means 9 divided by 3, is 3. So 2/3 would be double that, which makes 6. Now remember, all these are negative answers, so so I don't really need to talk about having that negative number there. Okay, 0.25 is really the same as 1/4 of it, right? And one way you can do 1/4 is first do a half. Half of 12 is 6, and then do half of that half. A fourth is half of a half, right? You're splitting it into 2 parts twice. So, and then half of 6 is 3. So we get -3. You can split up these. You could do the 5 times the 1 first, which is 5, and then do the 5 times 0.2. Well, that's where you have to think of 0.2 is 2 out of 10, 2/10, or 1 out of 5. And since we're multiplying by 5, 1 out of 5 would be 1 more. So you get 6. All right, so let's do a few multiplication problems for real-life situations. Number 14 says, what is her elevation after 1 minute? She starts at an elevation at 0, and she's going down under the water, and she's going down 50 feet per minute. So each minute her elevation would be 50 feet below. So we're going to use a negative sign to show that. After 5 minutes, we would have to do -50, adding that 5 times, or we could just do -50 times 5, which is 50 times 5 is 250. So -50 times 5 would be -250. And so for every minute, we're going to multiply -50 times however many minutes there are. So -50 times n. If you're into algebra, when you're in 8th grade, we're just going to write, we're going to not put this or a symbol, we're just going to put whatever number we want to multiply by and then the letter right next to that. All right, so let's try a few here. Make sure you check out whether the sign is going to be negative or positive. Negative times a positive is a negative. So go ahead and do those 5 products. I think you probably noticed that we were going up by 3 every time. And that's because we kept taking away one repeated addition of -3, right? So if we take away one of those, we're going to end up with 3 more each time. Okay, so thinking about that, the next one in this series would be -3 times, notice that these numbers go 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So the next one we would do is -3 times -1, and that would have to be 3 more again. So this is got to be 3. -3 times -1. And this has got to be 6, because we're going to add 3 every time, right? So go ahead and finish those. So I think we're learning something here. It seems like when we're multiplying 2 negatives, so let's write this out like this, a negative times a negative, it seems like we are getting positive answers all the time, which is true. And if you think about addition, how when we were taking away a negative, when we had negatives right next to each other, 2 of them, we actually got a positive. So this is a similar idea. So the product of a positive number, you guys, product means multiply, right? All right, the product of a positive number and negative number, we found out that that is, go ahead, you circle which one you think, always negative. The product of a negative number and a negative number, we just found that out. Go ahead and circle the correct response. Always positive. And so what do you think would happen if we multiplied 3 negatives? Well, if we took a negative times a negative, that would be a positive, right? And if we multiply that by one more negative, we would have a positive times a negative, which would be a negative. So 3 negative numbers multiplied would equal a negative number. Okay, what about 4 negative numbers? So 4 negative numbers. So I'm just going to use n now. How about that? A negative times a negative times a negative times a negative. I think you guys are thinking ahead of me, but those two would be a positive, right? Those two would be a positive because a negative times a negative is a positive, and definitely a positive times a positive is positive. We are used to that. All right, so let's finish up here, and first of all, let's figure out, if you have an odd number of negatives, then the product will be negative. If you have an even number of negatives that you're multiplying, the product will be positive. So count up how many negatives you have and then figure out whether it's going to be positive or negative. So we have 3 negatives, so our answer is going to be negative because that's an odd number of negatives. And then we can just do our multiplication. Now, you can rearrange them so you can do it easily, a little more easily. I would do the 5 times 2 first. That's 10 because it's easy to multiply by 10. 10 times negative 3, and we know we're going to have a negative answer, so it's negative 30. Let's count how many negative factors there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's an odd number, which means our answer is going to be negative. And then we're just going to do the product. You can just do these in a row, I think. 1 times 2 is 2, times 3 is 6, times 1 is 6, times 2 is 12. Okay? And if you have an even number of negative numbers, the product is positive. So here's some examples of that. 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives. So we're going to have a positive answer. And when we have a positive answer, let's not put a plus sign. Let's just do the math. Remember that multiplying by 1 does not change the answer, so really we can just do 2 times 2 here, which is 4. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives here, so that's an even number, so we're going to have a positive answer. Again, the 1s aren't going to make any difference, so we can just look at 2 times 3 is 6, times 2 is 12, times 2 is 24. All right? So let's suppose that the product of 2 integers means positive or negative wholes, is negative 14. List all the possibilities. So go ahead and pause there, see if you can get them all, and then you can check and see if you got them right. Those are the 4 possible answers. Now, yeah, don't worry about the order. The order doesn't matter when you're multiplying. All right, suppose you need positive 12. What could the integers be? List all the possibilities. Well, now remember that to get a positive number, you can also do a negative times a negative. So you have to consider those possibilities. So give it a shot here. I'll give you a couple examples. You could do 1 times 12. You could also do negative 1 times negative 12. See if you can get the rest. Here's what I'm thinking. Hopefully you got them all. All right. On this one, this means what number times 3? 3 times what number equals negative 6? And the answer for that is, since we need a negative, we need to multiply by a negative. So I'm thinking negative 2. So x equals negative 2. Okay. Thinking ahead here, go ahead and you try and figure it out. Negative 2 times what number gives you 14? Now we have a positive here, we have a negative here, so we need a negative times a negative to get a positive. And that should tell you that y equals negative 7. Okay? Let's do a couple more problems here, and then you can go on and do your practice. Andrea owes each of her 4 sisters $10. You guys, when you owe somebody, that's a negative. So we're going to put negative 10. Now she has 4 sisters, so we're going to multiply that by negative 4. And that will equal the total she owes. And you guys are probably thinking, well, that sounds like, oops, that's not a negative, that's a positive there. That sounds like she owes about $40, right? Okay. The temperature was 0 degrees at midnight. For the next 8 hours, the temperature dropped 3 degrees each hour. So a drop of 3 degrees, that's a negative. And we're doing that for 8 hours, so let's multiply that by 8. A negative times a positive is a negative. And that will give us the new temp. All right, that's it for today. You can go ahead and start working on your homework, and we'll talk to you soon.